They control invaders, reduce pests, and maintain the natural balance of everything around them. No fences, no surveillance, no human intervention, just presence and impact. These are the wild dogs known as dingoes, predators that, without fanfare, restructure entire ecosystems, influence the behavior of other species, and help contain some of the greatest threats to local biodiversity. In this video, you'll discover how these animals silently shape the environment and what happens when they disappear. For decades, dingoes were classified as pests. Considered wild dogs, they were targets of extermination campaigns, exclusion fences, traps, and mass poisoning. The largest of these barriers, the infamous dingo fence, stretches over 3,480 miles, one of the longest structures on the planet, built solely to keep these animals away from southeastern Australia, where intensive livestock farming predominates. But as dingoes were removed from certain regions, something unexpected began to happen. Without them, invasive species like rabbits, wild pigs, cats, and red foxes began to multiply. Native birds disappeared. Vegetation was decimated. The soil became unstable. What was once a balanced chain turned into an uncontrolled game of biological dominance. Where dingoes exist, they control. Where they disappear, the system collapses. Not by accident, they occupy the top of the food chain with rare precision. A dingo weighs, on average, between 35 to 62 pounds. But it's not the weight that defines their impact. It's their predatory intelligence, their ability to operate alone or in groups, to adapt strategies, change prey, and adjust their behavior according to the environment. Standing between 20 and 24 inches tall and reaching lengths that can exceed 3.6 feet. Their body is lean, fast, resilient. It was shaped by natural selection over thousands of years to withstand hunger, heat, scarcity, distance. Their coat varies from light sand to rust red, with black, white, and mottled variations, each tone associated with the habitat they occupy, as if their appearance obeyed geography. But what truly impresses is how they communicate. Dingoes don't bark. They howl, a long, clean howl that echoes in the dusk of the Australian plains like an acoustic signature. They howl to mark territory, gather the pack, respond to calls. They also communicate with glances, postures, almost imperceptible growls. And they know when to stay silent, especially near humans. They are, in essence, highly organized social predators. They live in groups with clear family structure, usually formed by a dominant pair and their direct descendants. They cooperate in hunting, caring for pups, and guarding territory. But they can also act alone, especially in denser zones where there's an abundance of prey and more human presence. This behavioral flexibility makes them virtually uncontrollable, and at the same time, indispensable. The ecological impact of dingoes isn't limited to hunting. By controlling intermediate species, they reduce pressure on smaller prey and vegetation. They decrease populations of foxes and feral cats, two of the biggest culprits behind the extinction of Australia's endemic mammals. They preserve birds, protect eggs, prevent population outbreaks. Their cascading effect has been compared to Yellowstone's wolves. But with a difference. In Australia, they weren't reintroduced. They never left. They were just ignored. Their territory covers practically the entire continent except Tasmania, where the thylacine, also called the Tasmanian tiger, occupied a similar ecological position before being extinct. In its place today, what we see are deregulated ecosystems, taken over by exotic predators that threaten everything that evolved there for millions of years. In practice, the dingo came to occupy this vacuum, not as an invader, but as a functional substitute. They arrived in Australia about 4,000 years ago, probably brought by navigators from Southeast Asia. Science still debates whether this makes them native or not. But for the environment, this distinction no longer matters. After millennia of adaptation, the dingo has deeply integrated into the natural functioning of the territory. It became part of the cycles, rhythms, and invisible interdependencies that keep a biome standing. Modern science recognizes the dingo as a separate species, different from the domestic dog, different from wolves. It's a missing link between the wild ancestor and the animal adapted to modernity, and at the same time, a survivor, but the system still treats it as a problem. Farmers call for their elimination. Governments apply contradictory regional laws. In some areas, the dingo is protected. In others, it's hunted. In many cases, their mere presence is used as justification for preventive culling, even without proven damage to livestock. This punitive approach ignores decades of scientific data showing that, in many cases, removing dingoes increases economic damage by allowing the uncontrolled explosion of invasive species that cause much greater harm. There's a cruel paradox in progress. The predator that helps maintain balance is systematically excluded from the very system it tries to preserve, and even so, it remains there. Howling at dusk, patrolling the surroundings, running across the plains without knowing that its role is vital, and that its existence depends on human decisions increasingly distant from ecological logic. The dingo isn't just an animal, it's a living frontier between what Australia was and what it can still be. And until we look at it clearly, we'll keep pushing the continent toward a silent collapse, slow, inevitable, and invisible. The arrival of dingoes to Australian territory marked the beginning of a silent but profound transformation. After their introduction about 4,000 years ago, these highly adaptable predators quickly spread across the continent, occupying ecological niches previously filled by now extinct carnivores. But their influence wasn't limited to the environment. Over time, dingoes became part of the very cultural structure of many Aboriginal societies. For various indigenous peoples, the dingo was more than an animal. It was a hunting companion, a spiritual symbol, a clan member. Anthropological documents show that in some regions, dingoes were raised as part of families, sleeping beside children to protect them from the desert cold, helping on expeditions, and even being depicted in cave paintings. Their relationship with Australia's original peoples resembles in some ways the connection between Arabs and domesticated cheetahs for hunting. A functional alliance, but also symbolic. However, this cultural integration didn't survive colonial advancement. With the accelerated expansion of livestock farming in the 19th century, especially large-scale sheep raising, dingoes came to be seen not as allies, but as economic enemies. Their hunting of flocks was used as justification for radical population control policies, and thus was born one of modern Australia's most emblematic structures, the dingo fence, a fence of over 3,480 miles, built with the objective of isolating dingoes from the agricultural regions of the country's southeast. An unprecedented ecological wall created to interrupt the natural flow of a predator, and with it, the entire system it sustained. The consequence was twofold. On one hand, temporary protection of livestock. On the other, progressive imbalance of ecosystems on the other side of the fence. With dingoes absent, the ecological vacuum was filled by invasive species that had been introduced after European colonization. And in this new scenario, damage began to multiply. Among the most destructive invaders are feral cats. Domesticated for centuries, but in Australia, they escaped control and became voracious predators of small mammals, birds, and reptiles. It's estimated they kill more than 1 million native animals per day, directly contributing to the extinction of dozens of endemic species. This is where the dingo's function proves vital. Where there are dingoes, there are fewer cats. Scientific studies show that in areas with healthy dingo populations, the number of feral cats is significantly lower. And the impact goes beyond direct hunting. Cats avoid territories dominated by dingoes. They alter their activity patterns. They change zones. They start hiding more. Researchers call this the landscape of fear, a landscape modified not by violence, but by the possibility of violence. And this possibility, when it comes to dingoes, is sufficient to rebalance the game. The same occurs with another environmental enemy, the European red fox, introduced to Australia in the 19th century for sport hunting. Like cats, foxes became highly destructive pests. They hunt eggs of native birds, small marsupials, and reptiles with extreme efficiency. And where dingoes disappear, foxes flourish. Where dingoes persist, they retreat. Dingoes don't just prey on these species, they redefine their behavior. They create invisible barriers. They destabilize their cycles. And thus, they protect species that would otherwise be silently extinct. But their impact doesn't end with medium predators. Dingoes also act as regulators of invasive herbivores, like feral goats, wild boars, and introduced deer, all species that compete directly with native fauna for food and severely damage local vegetation. In arid and semi-arid regions, where vegetation is already naturally scarce, the presence of dingoes reduces grazing pressure exerted by these animals. By consistently preying on them, dingoes have allowed, in some locations, the regeneration of native plants and the return of microhabitats previously compromised. And here enters a cascade effect that goes far beyond predator and prey. With reduced herbivory pressure, soil recovers, ground vegetation recomposes, and small mammals and reptiles find shelter again. This, in turn, sustains other trophic chains, including birds of prey, quolls, and even native insectivores. It's the invisible chain of dingo presence. Predator controls herbivore and medium carnivore. This reduces predation on small natives. Vegetation recovers, soil retains more water. Secondary species reappear, ecosystem reorganizes. And all this happens without human planning, without government intervention, without subsidies. But this isn't a fairy tale. Dingo activity also has its grey areas. In environments where habitat has been severely degraded, dingo presence can aggravate pressures on vulnerable native species. Small marsupials in fragmented areas or isolated biological islands can indeed suffer negative impacts. That's why biologists and environmental managers advocate for a specific approach for each biome, where the dingo isn't seen as villain or hero, but as part of a complex, dynamic, and interdependent system. The mistake is treating it as a standard problem. The right approach is seeing it as a natural tool for adaptive control. Today, while part of Australia still debates its legitimacy as a native species, other countries analyze the case with curiosity. In a world where biological control costs increase year after year, the dingo offers an evolutionary answer, a living, autonomous, effective solution, and ignored. Meanwhile, it continues, hunting at nightfall, hearing what no one hears, rebalancing, without degree or decree, what environmental policies fail to preserve.